Hey there, everybody. It's Mike Yao with Savage Kingdoms role-playing game, Fire in the Head Productions. As my cat, my calico, is in the background right there. You can see, much more interesting than me, probably. So anyway, doing a video today about dragons. So I haven't done a video in I don't know, a week or two, so I thought I would start to kind of get back into the lore of Savage Kingdoms, and which is my role-playing game. Red Sun is coming up. It's going to have dragons in it too, although probably not featured as much. And of course, there's Dungeons and Dragons, right? With dragons and then fantasy in general. The dragon is probably by far the most iconic creature from medieval fantasy. You might make a case for, say, like unicorns or griffins or something like that, but I think 99% of us would probably agree it is dragons. In fact, on the core rulebook cover of the Savage Kingdoms 3rd edition role-playing game core rulebook, we feature a dragon, a drake, a wyrm, to go through several synonyms for a dragon. But yeah, so if you're going to feature a dragon on your core rulebook, you might feature them in your game, right? You might want to talk about them. So thought I would do that today just a little bit. So just to kind of kick it off from a personal standpoint, I'm a big dragon fan. I know that's not unusual for a person who likes fantasy or medieval fantasy in particular, sword and sorcery. I was born in the year of the dragon. I've always really connected to dragons. My Chinese zodiac symbol is a dragon, so I have several layers of dragon. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons back in 1979, a long time ago. And so, yeah, that kind of stuff has always kind of appealed to me, right? So you have the Western dragon, which is typically an antithesis to good. It's almost a representation of evil in a way. In fact, in the Bible, the dragon is often associated as a creature of evil, a demonic thing almost, right? Eastern dragons tend to be somewhat more benevolent in Eastern lore. Not always. Sometimes they also represent storms and thunder and things that suddenly come in they're kind of forces of nature. They're almost like more elemental. Whereas Western dragons maybe are a little more physical in a sense, although there's a spiritual bent to them, going back to the good and evil thing. So yeah, it's kind of interesting all the different takes of dragons in the real world. And that's just a generality between West and East. Like I said, some of the Eastern dragons can get kind of nasty too. And occasionally, although it's rare, you find a story or a tale or two about a good Western dragon as well. And so it's kind of a generalization. Speaking of which, in Savage Kingdoms, dragons are, just to go through some quick, cool little facts about dragons that might be different than other settings. Probably the biggest thing in Savage Kingdoms, those of you who play probably already know this, dragons in Savage Kingdoms in my setting is they are asexual. So there are no male and female. They all lay eggs. So they're neither or both, however you want to look at it. I guess both technically, since they're laying eggs, right? So and my reason for that goes back. I came. This is like a long time ago. This is from when this setting used to be like an old Dungeons and Dragons setting. Later became its own thing, and that's why I published Savage Kingdoms 7 or 8 years ago, the first edition. I just always had that dragons were asexual. There were no genders with dragons, and the reason I was doing that was I wanted them to seem so ancient and so non-human that in other words, they were created in a time before gender was even necessary. Meaning that in the setting of the world, that the gods or elemental forces, intelligent forces that we would consider divine, had a hand in crafting and creating everything. Whenever you craft or create a creature or a species with gender, with offspring producing gender, that means you're kind of giving them free reign to populate, right? Which is cool. But the point being, I was just kind of going back to a primal time, and that's kind of the idea I kind of had with that. So dragons are in Savage Kingdoms. Go back to, I'm just going to look at the little timeline at the beginning of the core rulebook here. The Age of Dragons was, here we go. This is the Savage Kingdoms core rulebook. At the front of the book, you've got the timeline of historical events, that sort of thing. You could probably see the Age of Dragons was 7,000 years ago. So pretty good while, but not massive. Some fantasy campaigns do the whole thing, the whole hundreds of thousands of years. The reason I didn't quite go overboard with time and Savage Kingdoms, to be quite honest, so I didn't, because I like to kind of fill in some of that stuff. I think it's a little hand wavy to go 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago. It's like that's kind of hand wavy, right? Kind of, so because now, if that's literally what you're saying, then if you want to detail your campaign, you have to write out those 100,000 years before. Now you could, and it's again, it's a little hand wavy to do so. You could just say simply that it's non-recorded history, nobody really knows, but we're assuming it's 1,000 years. When you go that route, that you're off the hook for having to write all your timeline out, right? But then the flip side of that becomes, the dichotomy becomes that, well, then how do you know it was 100,000 years ago if there's no real evidence of that? So just a little side note there. I know it doesn't really have to do with dragons, but it did kind of cue that thought for the Age of Dragons in the Savage Kingdom setting. Go back to 7,000 years ago. It says the first dragons were sea serpents, great worms that burrowed and undulated through the terrible waters like great scaly spears. They ruled supreme in the Dragon Sea, and soon the lesser ocean rivers beside. And even the occasional wandering god gave pass to the mighty drake and its wide-ranging territory. That's just the first paragraph. So, kind of shows you right there in the lore of the Savage Kingdom setting. The Dragon Sea is kind of the big sea that really separates the two main continents of Astagonia and Hassan, the quote eastern and western continents, as it were, sort of proto-Europe, proto-Asia in a sense. And so it's called the Dragon Sea because the first dragon was spotted in the ocean by probably a sailor, probably a fisherman. Nobody would have sailed across the Dragon Sea during that time. And it was this what we now would call a sea serpent, and what would later in the setting be called a sea serpent. So the first dragons were water-based, in other words, and then eventually, it goes on to say it, but I didn't want to read that whole little thing. They develop wings and become different, become what we consider true dragons nowadays in Savage Kingdoms, but also a couple little offshoots like wyverns or wyverns, however you want to pronounce it. I think it's more of a Welsh-based word, so therefore it'd be wyvern, but I think most people say wyvern. That's fine. So that type of creature, a basilisk, is a draconic creature in Savage Kingdoms as well. That's a wingless, scaled thing with acidic spittle and that sort of thing, right? So then you got the actual true dragons. Going on that note, so what we consider true dragons in Savage Kingdom setting would be there's really only there's three types. There's two main types. There are the fire-breathing dragons, right, that we all know and love, and we have ice-breathing dragons, which I think we all know and love as well. And then there's a third type that's extremely rare in Savage Kingdoms, which is kind of known as a storm dragon, most people call them, or a lightning drake. And those are the rare dragons that breathe lightning. So the other two, the main two, are fire and ice. I kind of want to do this fire and ice dichotomy, and this is before the Song of Fire and Ice, honestly, when all this lore was, I wrote this stuff 25, 30 years ago. Having not, so has nothing to do with that necessarily. Although I will say the cool Sword and Sorcery animated film from the 80s or late 70s called Fire and Ice might have had something to do with it. So anyway, fire and ice dragons, and then you have a very rare lesser form called a storm dragon. And they are associated with lightning and storms, and sometimes if associated more with the fairy realm, with the other world. They're almost a little more otherworldly than the other two types of dragons are very firmly based in the earth world, which is the Savage Kingdom's name for the prime material world, the mortal realm, what 99.9% of people would deal with on a day-to-day basis. So just a little side note right there. Let's see what else about dragons really quickly. So you'll notice there's three different stat blocks as far as games statistics go in the Savage Kingdoms role-playing game. I'm probably going to do the same in Red Sun. You've got a young dragon, you've got a middle-aged dragon, and you've got an elder worm or elder dragon, which is what we call usually it's a worm that's at least 500 years old. That's a nasty stat block, right? So no one's ever actually, I've been running Savage Kingdoms playtests and real games, and with friends and long running campaigns and convention games. No one has yet faced directly an elder worm in all these 8 or 9 years of running it, and even going back further, when it was more of a D&D Pathfinder setting instead of its own game system like it is now. Which I kind of like in a way, because I kind of like there's part of me that likes, I like the fact that the gods are kind of off stage and they're just kind of the lore and the suspicion of them and the minor influence of them is around, and I kind of like that with ancient dragons too. On the other hand, if somebody were to actually go to the lair of an ancient dragon, they're probably not going to encounter one just flying around randomly, which I'll get to in a second. That would also be really cool. But be prepared if you do that. Probably, unless you've got a big army with you and some really cool plans figured out, and some powerful magic, probably you're probably going to get obliterated. So, just as you would imagine, which is probably why it hasn't happened yet. Another reason it hasn't happened yet in Savage Kingdoms is that dragons are quite rare. So they're quite rare. So I think I've once said I'm guessing there's about, well, if you consider all the younger ones too, there's probably no more than a score of dragons, 20 or so dragons left in the entire known world. Only a few of them are named, so their names would be known through lore. What we call them is what humans would call them, or the She might call them, or the Dwargar might call them, or what they would call themselves. Probably not till around being a middle-aged dragon, which is typically 150 years old or something like that. Young dragon, it might call itself something, but it may not have enough renown for anybody else to really know of its name. And typically, because we are now in an era that dragons and Savage Kingdoms, at least the default timeline, which is like 721 Imperial calendar, Lorenthian calendar. If you're playing in that typical timeline of Savage Kingdoms, dragons are so rare, and people are kind of aware of them more, like the warrior societies, particularly ones that are societies that kind of deal on the edge, the hinterlands where a dragon might be known to lair. That has produced kind of a dragon slaying culture or subculture in a way. So in Savage Kingdoms, young dragons, and I suggest this for Dungeons and Dragons, whatever other games you're running. I think this is probably good advice for really most any setting. They tend to sort of hide. They kind of lay low, right? Trying to, and if they're with the parent dragon for a little while, or quite come up with the exact time. But I figure they stay with them for about 50 years, 40 to 50 years, making sure they get beyond hatchling and wormling, and then into kind of where they can fly more fully and have a little bit of wits about them and not just this kind of random, violent, kind of horrible creature. Because if that were true as a young dragon and it was just going out raiding villages and stuff, it would probably be killed relatively easy as a smaller dragon. Now, once they get to a middle-aged dragon and above, then they're kind of a force to be dealt with. They can kind of go raiding and plundering if they want to an extent. Again, they don't want to attract a lot of attention. In my current campaign that I'm running right now with my in-person group, good friends of mine, they're awesome, and some of them have been playtesters as well in the past. We're running the Blood Crown campaign, which will be coming out in Savage Kingdoms Heroic Adventures when I finally get it done with it. Got really good progress, actually. I'm about 85% done with it. So that campaign has gone beyond the scope of the actual Blood Crown. It's gone way into, we're close to session 50 at this point. It's like gone beyond, that's where it started, though. Anyway, so all that to say is that they have encountered a dragon in the Iceclaw Mountains, which is just kind of north of Malovia. Actually, it was probably technically in the Sanctuary Mountains, which kind of offshoot from the Iceclaw Mountains, which is like western Malovia. Kingdom of Malovia, also known as the Winter Kingdom. In any case, they heard a dragon roaring way off in the distance one night. It was super creepy. However, there's one character that has the dragon kindred talent, who's super fascinated with dragons, and I think it's part of his character history that he even studied briefly at the foot of a dragon. He was part of a draconic cult from the kingdom of Scathia to the north, which is kind of canon because several adventures have actually occurred around that whole draconic cult, which, according to canon, is not there anymore. The player characters kind of overthrew it. However, there was a remnant left over, and that is where this character kind of has his background with. So he decided one night, and it worked out perfectly because the player actually was not able to make it the next week or two. He's like a fellow actor like I am, so he was rehearsing for the stage production, I think. But anyway, so it was perfect. I had him go off to try to seek the dragon, and it kind of worked also because the rest of the party, they're making a play for power in the kingdom of Malovia. So spoilers, well, no, I'm not, never mind. I'm not going to say it because heroic adventures. Anyway, they found a relic that might help one of the characters become king of all Malovia. So he's actually from an ancient noble house, the von Mulovs, who actually gave their name to Malovia. So his ancestor was the first king of Malovia, and so now he is actually trying to claim the throne back to what's left of his family to become the new royal dynasty. His bloodline was never completely destroyed. So anyway, good stuff. It's good stuff, but it's neither here nor there. The point is that side character went off to find the dragon, made a couple of rolls for him to use his survival skills and stuff to try to find the dragon, hopefully without getting killed. And it worked out well, kind of like an off stage sort of thing. And makes friends. In fact, and then when he was actually present for this part, when he finally encountered, he found the cave of the dragon. There was ice hanging. It was really kind of a cool scene. I enjoyed describing it and setting the tension for it and watching for his replies and his reactions. And sure enough, there was a whitish blue scaled ice worm inside, a pretty good size, probably middle aged. Turns out he made a lore roll, succeeded. The dragon's name was Mithronax, so this dragon was actually somewhat well known, had some renown in the area, and it was a spawn of Volnathrax. So Volnathrax, you'll actually see that name in the book. Mithronax's name might actually be in there too. Now that I think about it, and then also Gethrax or Terengethrian is like the elder fireworm that's still alive in the setting. Although some people say no one's seen him in like 10 years. He kind of he hangs out in the Bloodrock Mountains, which is another major mountain range on the continent of Astagonia. However, this is in the Iceclaw Mountains, right in the north, where ice dragons are a little more common. This creature is a spawn of Vonathrax, so it claims a direct son/daughter offspring of Vonathrax. So anyway, he ends up critically succeeding a persuasion roll to talk to the dragon, which he knows dragon speech, which is the name of the draconic language in Savage Kingdoms. And critical success trying to persuade the dragon to help his friends gain power in the kingdom of Malovia. So the dragon's like, cool, so be it, I will help you, Magus Rifkin. And character player shout out. So Mithronax says he will help, of course, like any creature that's smart. He wants to know what's in return, what he gets in return. So he was promised that he could raid. He would be fed well, cattle or horses, whatever needs to be done, and any kind of treasure he might be able to hoard was part of the deal too. So, long story short, he got to fly on Mithronax too, which is really cool for the player because he, like me, he really likes dragons. And yes, this is all make believe, but the cool thing about role playing games is you make it, if you make it pretty real, right? People get pretty emotional, pretty much into some of these scenes and encounters that get run. I think people that don't game really quite get it. You can really allow yourself to get into it, especially if you've done some acting and some theater and you kind of know how to connect and resonate with some of these themes, especially with your character development. And so riding the dragon was like a kind of a big deal. I got to do that and blah, blah, blah. The campaign went on. They're still going on in that campaign. We're almost concluding it. Although I don't know, that's another thing I love about running adventures is I don't know when it's going to end. Like if you get a published adventure, you kind of know, but even then it could go off from there. This one is beyond the scope of the stuff I've written, so it's now mostly improv. I mean, I do it a little outline of what's probably going to happen in the next game or what I can guess to happen, but I let the players really kind of go and choose based on their characters. The setting is so detailed, especially for me because I'm the creator of it, right? There's still a lot more stuff in my head that's not even published, so they can really go anywhere in the world, and I know what's there and stuff. So I'm never quite lacking on those details, but anyway, a little side thing that did have to do with dragons, kind of. So back to a little bit more dragon lore based on what I just said. When dragons get really old, when they become what's considered elder worms, or in D&D terms, an ancient dragon, they sleep a lot. They sleep weeks, sometimes months at a time. They just have to. It's just their bodies are just They're so massive. Whenever, especially if they go if they fly for a bit, or they consume large amounts of food, and they'll just slumber as a typical predator might for, like I said, days, weeks, months. Vonithrax and Gethrax, or Terengethrian is the she name for him, the elven name. Those are those classified this. So they're said to, they're at least 450 years old, and many people believe they're over 500 years old. I'm not sure which one's the oldest of the two. I don't know if I've ever really come up with it. If I had to answer on the fly, I think Gethrax, the fire-breathing one, might be like 20 years older than Vonithrax. But once you get around 500 years old, that doesn't really matter that much. So kind of like D&D dragons, age is a big factor in dragon lore. They just get bigger and they get smarter is the scary thing. Now, dragons and savage kingdoms aren't the big magic wielders, the magic users or sorcerers that D&D ones are. They can be. An elder worm, there's might learn a few dragon spells, a few spells that it's learned. But the point is, when I was creating my own take on dragons, is that they don't really need that stuff. It's kind of, besides spells are kind of, at least the way I've interpreted it and the way I've really kind of incorporated in Savage Kingdoms and in Red Sun, it's almost like artificial magic. It's mortals working of, it's their way of kind of cheesing magic, right? When actual supernatural beings are the ones that really kind of do it at will almost. And so humans as mortals, we have to learn sorcery and alchemy and all these weird things to make some effect happen, right? So being that the case, dragons, particularly older dragons, they don't really need to know a spell or two. But I did leave it open that some of them do, and I think Gethrax does know a few like fire magic spells, and I think, I'm not sure if Vonithrax actually knows any spells, to be quite honest. But again, they don't really need it. Their breath weapons are super powerful. Their bites and their claw attacks and their tail attacks are super powerful, as you would imagine a dragon should be. If I have any occasional pet peeve with Dungeons and Dragons, I never thought the dragons are quite as potent as they should be until you really get up into ancient, or what we would call elder worm, and then they're kind of challenging. But the way the game scales, by the time you're running into a creature like that, the player characters are kind of ridiculous, and it ends up not being that great of a fight anyway, if that's what it comes down to. So yeah, which is kind of why I let Savage Kingdoms. Savage Kingdoms is not really level based, but it's advancement based. There's kind of a difference where level doesn't really matter as much as, say, D&D. So you could run into a dragon earlier on in your career, or much later, and it won't make as much of a difference between your character's abilities and powers. Yes, in Savage Kingdoms you do gain a lot of talents and skill, and you get pretty powerful, as you would in most role playing games. But I try to design it where it doesn't scale, like D&D scales up too quickly, in my opinion, where you should start a little higher and kind of a flattened thing. Anyway, another little side note. But having to do with draconic power and encountering dragons, I thought that was similar to what I was just talking about with scaling. So that's why I added it on another tangent. What else can I go over with dragons? Because I want to make this video, I want to end it here in a couple minutes. You saw some of the artwork there. Let's see, they fire. Oh yeah, so they typically speak several different languages. They're pretty smart. I haven't made them. If you notice, say in Dungeons and Dragons, like an ancient dragon, particularly an ancient metallic dragon, the good one, so to speak. Those guys can get 19, 20, 21 intelligence, which yeah, kind of makes sense. I kind of agree. I made mine, my elder dragons, almost as smart, but I toned it down a little bit. I wanted them to be a little more primal and a little more monstrous, but still also smart, right? Because why else would you live that long, particularly in a dragon slaying age that I talked about earlier? But I think when you're role playing your dragons, keep that in mind. Keep in the mind that they're very mysterious. They're very they're very alien in a sense, which is why, again, in Savage Kingdoms, I didn't give them gender. They spawned from the sea originally, so if you think deep sea monsters can be very aberrant-like and very strange and disconnected from humans. So if you keep that in mind, the fact that some might learn some weird spells here and there. The fact that most of them keep very hidden. They can still very arrogant. They're still very arrogant. A lot of them are, because they don't believe in gods. Again, they're from an age. They are gods themselves. Most of them believe. So yeah, so keep that in mind when you're role playing them. As far as the dragon lore going with collecting treasure, that's still there. That's very Tolkien. I like that. My setting, dragons are very driven by power, and power equals wealth. It's especially when reflecting it upon the human world, and so that's why they gather uh, treasures. Now, some of the dragons I give even more little personality traits to. Like one like loves gems in particular because they're just because sparkling, and they love having them nearby. There's some lore kind of based on Smaug and Middle Earth, and D&D kind of ran with it back in second edition, where sometimes the gems of their dragon hoard would be stuck between their scales, making their scales even tougher because there were gems kind of woven in there, or maybe even metallic coins. You could add that. I kind of stayed away from that to some degree because it can be a little bit cheesy, but it can also be really cool if you weave it in there correctly. Maybe not have the dragon specifically weaving gems into a scale. That seems a little kind of silly a little bit, but maybe the fact that he or she slumbers upon this massive mound of treasure so often that they just become embedded. And I think that's what Tolkien was kind of describing with Smaug and his lair. Um, yeah, I think that's about it. And as they get older, their scales get thicker. D&D kind of had the lore, and I kind of ran with it with Savage Kingdoms as well. Dragons tend to be a little more reflecty, like they reflect light more. They're a little more shiny when they're younger, and their scales get duller as they get older, and also thicker. So they become, they start off as like thick reptile, like crocodile skin, sort of like in the real world, all the way to like almost pretty much as just about as hard as full like steel plate armor, or at least as like metallic scale armor that Dwargar and humans and she might produce. So I think that's going to be it. I think I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm sure I'll come up with a couple of different little things about dragons to let you guys know, but I think that's about it to go on. Just want to do a little video about dragon lore. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know. Maybe I'll do some more of these videos about. Maybe next one will be about demons and angels and their connection in Savage Kingdoms, and maybe some other stuff. So, but for now, that's it about dragons, and I will talk to you guys again soon.